Start. Good afternoon, and we are here for a meeting with Greg Lukianoff and Martina Saltamacchia. I'm going to introduce them to you. Greg Lukianoff is the president of FIRE, a foundation that protects individual rights in the educational world, and he works mostly on the First Amendment of the American Institution, wrote in 1791, so 228 years ago, that protects individual rights from the influence of the government, in particular in relation to the freedom of assembly, of press, of expression, and also to sort of submit petitions to the government in case of problems. So is a lawyer and is also the author of a book published last year that was for 4 weeks in the New York Times bestsellers list. It's entitled The Coddling of the American Mind, and he wrote it together with Jonathan Haidt. The subtitle gives you a flavor of the content he's going to share to you with today. So how good intentions and bad ideas are setting up a generation for failure. To my left, we have Professor Martina Saltamacchia. She's a full professor, an associate professor of medieval history and director of medieval and Renaissance studies at the University of Nebraska in Omaha, a land of pioneers in the American Midwest. She published several books, and she specialized in the Middle Ages and in cathedral construction. So today she's going to tell us more about the freedom and solitude in the American experiment. So this topic stems from a sort of thought-provoking issue. The U.S., the United States, was established somehow to people that left history to find a place of freedom to build up their lives. So from the very beginning, there was a great desire to protect these found liberty. Over the last few years, and Greg is going to talk about this, it seems that a certain fear about the use of freedom has sort of trickled down into society. So Greg Lukianoff is going to show to us what is happening and how this is happening, especially in American universities. And he works as a lawyer protecting the individual rights of expression of professors, in particular. Professor Saltamacchia is going to shed some light, being an historian and living in the land of pioneers. She's going to shed some light on another aspect. And she's a professor at Nebraska University, so she's going to shed some light on the tools that we can use to better understand this topic. So by having a look at the history of pioneers and what they experienced, especially in the very first years of life. So I don't want to elaborate too much on this introduction, so the floor goes to Greg Lukianoff.
First of all, I just wanted to say thank you so much for having me. I am a huge fan of Josè and Martina. I'm very honored to be here. And a huge fan of Italy. I unfortunately have a bit of a cold. I don't normally sound like this, but so my book with social psychologist Jonathan Haidt, The Coddling of the American Mind, opens with a tall tale. My co-author and I explained our journey to the height of Mount Olympus to talk to a supposedly great wise man named Misoponos. We are searching We are searching for what on earth has gone wrong on American college campuses and in American society in general that has bred intolerance for freedom of speech, skyrocketing rates of depression and anxiety, and political polarization. Mesoponos proceeds to give us 3 pieces of advice. What doesn't kill you makes you weaker. Always trust your feelings, and life is a battle between good people and evil people. Both of us are horrified in this made-up story. We know from our own experience, modern psychology, and both Eastern and Western ancient wisdom, that this is absolutely awful advice, as we think most readers will instantly recognize as well, although some don't, amazingly. But then we challenge the reader to ask themselves, if we think this is such awful advice, then why are we implicitly teaching all of these, what we call great untruths, to young people, both directly and indirectly? To boil down the argument of our book, we shouldn't be surprised that a generation of young people are increasingly anxious, depressed, and polarized because we, their parents, professors, and teachers, are teaching them the intellectual habits of depressed and anxious people. So how did we come to this conclusion? Let's take a step backward to explain my career, starting in 2001, working defending freedom of speech on American college campuses. When people both inside and outside of the United States think of free speech on college campuses, they probably think of the phrase political correctness. And while that is certainly a factor, a lot of these cases we see don't look like this stereotype. In this slide, you'll see several cases, the first involving a student who wanted to put on a comedy musical but was shut down by students and the administration. We made a documentary about this called Can We Take a Joke? That's available on most streaming services. It's a good film. Next to him is a student who got arrested for simply trying to pass out shut down capitalism flyers. Next to her is an empty Texas Tech free speech gazebo, the sole area for freedom of speech for all 28,000 students on that particular campus. And on the lower level are students who simply wanted to hand out copies of the United States Constitution, which includes the full text of our famous First Amendment, which provides globally unmatched promises of freedom of speech that make all of the behaviors I mentioned previously unconstitutional on their campus, and were told that they couldn't, and that they would have to limit free speech, any free speech they took part in, to the tiny, ugly free speech zone next to the picture. It was actually a free speech swamp, as we came to call it. Hopefully, everyone understands that all of these cases involve violations of the United States' very strong protections of free speech. Indeed, for a long time, most campuses flagrantly violated free speech protections by passing speech codes, like the following bans on harsh text messages or emails, which I think it's safe to say everyone has done from time to time, or most ridiculously, inappropriately directed laughter. So my line of work is pretty strange. Defending freedom of speech at the one place where everyone assumed free speech is the most protected. My view of all this, however, changed when I fell into a deep depression in 2007, which I explain in some detail in the book. I was hospitalized, and at the time I thought I would never recover. What saved my life, to be frank, was a therapeutic practice called cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. It's very popular globally. To greatly oversimplify, CBT is learning how to talk back to your own obsessive, exaggerated, negative, and fearful thoughts using rational argument instead of what are called cognitive distortions, which I'll be talking more about later. But as I was teaching myself not to engage in wildly exaggerated catastrophizing, it was impossible to miss that campuses seem to be modeling this behavior every day, teaching it by example. While I explain countless examples in my first book in 2012 called Unlearning Liberty, let me give you just one example. This is a professor in New Jersey was immediately suspended and sent to psychiatric care after posting this picture of his daughter doing yoga, a yoga pose in a Game of Thrones t-shirt on social media. The shirt includes a quote from one of the main characters, whom some of you might know, Daenerys Targaryen, and it reads, "I will take what is mine with fire and blood." The show was one of the most successful in American history, but the university was oblivious to it, arguing that the fire the T-shirt refers to could be a threat from the professor to kill everyone at the college. That is some top-notch catastrophizing, and I saw a lot of it every day during my career at Fire. But from my first day in 2001 until about 2013, students seemed to be rolling their eyes at these overwrought behavior by adults. But then suddenly and very rapidly, that all changed. Here is one example from Dartmouth College that happened right before the big shift. One student literally drove his car over this display of little American flags. The little American flags were an attempt to protest a Supreme Court decision that made abortion legal all across the country. Not only is driving his car over someone else's display very dangerous, it was made all the more ironic by the student's "Coexist" bumper sticker on the back of his car. You would see this cognitive dissonance a lot in students. They believed they were so tolerant that they had to be intolerant to people who are not, in their opinion, quite as tolerant. 2013 was when we started seeing the rise in student efforts to disinvite speakers considered controversial, and it was the first time we heard about things like trigger warnings, safe spaces, and microaggressions, the latter of which are small verbal forms of violence against underrepresented groups. This is a concept that I think is very important, but look how it turned out when it was put in place by administrators. As you can see at UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles, lists many statements most Americans would consider harmless, like, "I believe the most qualified person should get the job," or "America is a land of opportunity," as a tiny form of violence against the oppressed. Also around this time, students were increasingly medicalizing reasons for speech suppression, as if students were fragile. They could be easily medically and permanently damaged by simply having an unpopular speaker on campus. It was also around this time that we started hearing reports that college mental health centers were overwhelmed. This is when I started to wonder that if my concerns about teaching a generation the habits of both censorship and of anxiety and depression were starting to really present itself. So I approached my then new friend, Jonathan Haidt, about my CBT/free speech theory. Much to my surprise and delight, he loved it. So in 2015, we wrote an article for The Atlantic magazine, also called Coddling of the American Mind. In our article, we discussed cognitive distortions and how we think that students were suddenly manifesting the mental habits of not only intolerance, but also of anxiety and depression. Cognitive distortions include things like catastrophizing, mind reading, fortune telling, and other mental exaggerations. The example I usually give of this is going on a date that goes poorly and saying to yourself, "I'm awful and I am going to die alone." All of us have thought similar things from time to time, but they are way out of line with a usually much humbler reality. Other cognitive distortions include things like emotional reasoning, which is at the heart of great untruth number 2, your feelings are always right, and overgeneralizing and dichotomous thinking, which pretty much defined great untruth number 3, which is that the world is divided only into good and evil people. The article struck a chord, becoming at one point the second most read cover story in the history of The Atlantic magazine, which is not bad for a magazine established in 1857. But despite the success of the article, the situation got much worse, both on campus and off. The election of Donald Trump sent all of these trends into overdrive, resulting in the first serious campus violence initiated by students I had seen in my career. This violence included assaults on Charles Murray, attempts to blockade other speakers from having an audience, and most notoriously, the large-scale riots at UC Berkeley, where students successfully prevented a right-wing provocateur from giving a talk. The riots were much worse than I thought going into the book. All of this led John and I to decide that we had to go farther and write a book examining what the hell was going on. I should confess I never liked the title Coddling of the American Mind. I thought it might be too insulting to the people who we most desperately needed to read it. I preferred calling it Disempowered, because I think many of these elite colleges were taking what were excellent students and turning them into people who were fearful, furious, and filled with feelings of futility. What we discovered was the students who started entering college between 2013 and 2014 were an entirely new generation, very different from the generation before them. As you can see from this slide, it was a generation that was growing up much more slowly, putting off major teenage milestones, driving a car, having sex, drinking, until later ages. This new generation, starting with the people born in 1995 and after, have been called Generation Z, or Gen Z. In 2015, there just wasn't enough data yet to be sure that the mental health decline was real or serious. Unfortunately, it not only proved to be both real and serious, but more dramatic than either of us had ever expected. Depression rates indeed skyrocketed, and those students were hitting college right around the time that we noticed the big shift in 2013-2014. Self-reports of depression went way up, particularly for young women. Meanwhile, commonly held theories about this increase in depression and anxiety didn't match up, considering that students were not even reporting increases in stress previously, nor even substantial concern about rising student debt. Some critics assume that the self-reporting was just the result of students more comfortable with saying they were depressed. But that doesn't match up at all. For example, consider these two statistics. Here are hospital admissions for non-fatal self-harm committed by girls before Generation Z, usually some form of cutting, harming oneself. This is what it looks like after Gen Z started hitting puberty. And worst of all, the suicide rate is up for boys and way up for girls. Indeed, note that the suicide rate for young women from around 2008 today has doubled in the United States. So why is this happening? We offer 6 causal threads. And a super quick side note to explain what's going on campuses. We are mostly focused on higher education and middle and upper middle class children. The problems facing poor students in the United States are of a very different nature and are well covered in other books, including books by Robert Putnam. So first, to deal with what's going on campus, I can say with good confidence, being on the front lines of campus battles, that things have gotten worse in recent years, partially due to the massive expansion of campus bureaucracy, which tends to react to even the smallest incidents, thereby teaching cognitive distortions and fostering moral dependency, the idea that someone will always handle conflicts for you. Also on campuses, students are being taught a model of social justice that is much more Manichaean and emphasizes an all-out war of the oppressed versus oppressors. Indeed, this may surprise some people, but Generation Z in the United States actually shows lower levels of empathy. Many of these students believe so strongly in standing up for even the smallest minorities in our society that they show very little empathy towards the great majority of people in the U.S. who might have even slightly different points of view. Then we turn over to parenting. And in the United States, I'm sure you're aware that we've been very critical of the development of a style of parenting that we call helicopter parenting. That is hovering over students, hovering over your children obsessively. This also results in the decline of free play, which was a surprising factor for us to deliver. But we sincerely believe that overscheduled children and young people fail to learn basic skills of association and basic skills of living in a free society by growing up with every minute of the day for them planned by their parents. And here is the most important one. Why now? Why did this happen so quickly? Social media is the most likely culprit. It's the only major sudden change that correlates perfectly with the other major sudden changes. This is the first generation of students to grow up with social media and smartphones in their pockets. This, we believe, is why there has been an increase in depression, anxiety, and girls as social media allows the worst of the movie Mean Girls to be a reality 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And social media has added to our big sort problem in America, that we are now able to move into communities both on and offline that are more politically homogeneous. This leads to a polarization spiral and greater ideological hostility, a trend we can see also in other countries. Thus you arrive at the three great untruths. What doesn't kill you makes you weaker, which violates the psychological principle that children are anti-fragile. Always trust your feelings. We are all prone to emotional reasoning and confirmation bias. And life is a battle between good people and evil people. The psychological principle violated is we're all prone to tribalism and dichotomous thinking. So that's our argument in a nutshell. Once again, thank you for having me, and please do not be distracted as I continue to take pictures for Twitter and Instagram of all you lovely people and my friends José and Martina.
Insegno da una.
Well, I've been teaching for 10 years now at an American university, so what Greg has talked about is a reality I know pretty well. And I'm starting seeing now the consequences both on students and professors, in particular when it comes to the possibilities of dialogue, knowledge, and teaching. In particular, over the last 7 years, as José said, I've been living in Nebraska. That it's an incredible place, especially for an Italian. And as an historian, I decided to get to know more about its history. So the state of Nebraska was established 155 years ago. Before the arrival of the first European explorators, the region had been inhabited for thousands of years by several indigenous tribes that then in 1700 are massacred by Europeans, and then in 1800 have to leave their territories and are put in reserves. In 1862, a year after the starting of the American Secession War, the Congress adopts some measures, Homestead Acts, that assign to anybody applying for that 160 acres of land. So 270 million of acres, more than 1 million square kilometers, mostly meadows land and wild land, are given for free to these people, to these applicants that are called homesteaders. So in order to reclaim this land and become owners, homesteaders have to sort of live there in the assigned plot for at least 5 years, plow the land and improve the land. So more than 1.5 million people, men, women, with both widow and single women, families and liberated slaves, immigrants, responded to announcements like this one. So land for those who are without land, so land for homeless people, so millions of hectares that are given for free to the most courageous pioneers of the world and given for free by the generous American government. Millions of hectares of corn and meadowland. So the fruit will pay for the land and the improvement. And so these people decide to go west to these brand new world. But what happens to these men and women once they get there? The very first impact is a double side impact. First of all, on the one hand, you're so surprised, you're gobsmacked by this huge meadowland, the expansive land. On the other hand, they see no familiar element. Willa Cather describes in a novel the arrival of a group of pioneers into Nebraska. Willa Cather herself moves there with her family when she's 9 years old, and so she tells her personal experience. So this is mirrored in the vast majority of her novels, and she writes. I creeped carefully out of the bison skin, and I sat on my knees and I watched out. There was no fence, no creek, no tree, no hill. If there was a road, I couldn't see it in the light of the stars. I haven't seen a sky that helped me see some familiar mountains, but that was such a starry sky. I had the sensation of having left the rest of the world behind me, of having reached the boundaries of Earth. There was nothing else but land, just the matter countries are made of. So, under quotation, it is with these ingredients, with these raw materials, that people can start a new life. This is the American experiment. So the mysterious possibility of starting everything from scratch once again without having to rely on specific previous origins or commonly shared traditions. So in the hope to improve the world, make it fairer and better. And so the lack of pre-existing institutions and powers together with these huge natural spaces so open up an ocean of possibilities. So the fact of being able to do and construct without conditioning of the state or the church leads Americans to refund everything, even their own religious traditions. So the incredible landscape and the limitless sort of condition of the countries of opportunities. These are the refrains that appear continuously in the songs and in the writings of the Americans. Everything is possible, as Pioneer Ed writes to his friend Evie to convince it to come and settle down in Dakota. I have a plot of land. I could sell it for 1,000, but it will be worth 5 times as much in a few years, maybe 10 times as much. I will plow my land and grow some crops, settle down some cattle, and I then will just get rich and wait for my money to grow. And a young couple would be crazy to stay east. Here they can get free land, 160 acres. You can't even imagine what a nice plot for cattle it is until you start plowing the land. But not everything is so simple. And we read in a text by a woman to her Aunt Martha, say grasshoppers have destroyed the gardens. Well, we need to be able to grow something, otherwise we have to buy everything, but we have very little money. We have good appetite, that seems to be good, but actually it's absolutely not good. We do not have a house. We wanted to build up something, but we just have a hut, and we risk to die of cold. But maybe George was right. We could die of cold. And Ed the pioneer warns his friend, and he says and writes, West is not a place for bashful people, not for delicate hearts. Everything that the West wants from the people coming here is to stay there, to remain there. And if they succeed, well, they're going to win. So rigorous life conditions, working hard all through the day, never quit, never give up, no going anywhere else, and try to be open up to any work, any possibility. Well, then, if you are like that, you can make it here in the West. But still, even with the best intentions and with all sacrifice, there's a lot of room for concern and solitude that seem to characterize the journey of a pioneer between the lost home and the new unknown home. Young Harriet gets to Kansas from Massachusetts and writes, "It's a beautiful evening, and our vast meadow seems to be green and soft, and it unfolds far away in the horizon, and the clear waters of our river are just so bright, and there are beautiful dark green forests that seem to be a painting against a white sky, a clear sky as a backdrop. So certainly it's the most beautiful region I've ever seen, but certainly no other place on earth seems to so sweet as the hills of Massachusetts with their little nice white villages that are sort of clustered together in sheltered corners. So here the Meadowland is beautiful and vast and so big and huge, but I miss the old trees, the gardens, the flowers. Well, and Massachusetts, how much I loved it. I will never ever be able to call this place home. Very often when I wake up on a Saturday morning, I see the sun shining and I hear the sort of noise made by the people in the streets. Then I think to the sweetness of my old house, my youngest years, the fresh, crispy air of the morning, and the scent of fruit trees and garden flowers, and my siblings who were just hanging around in the garden, reading the shadow of a tree, and my old father with white hair just reading the Bible on his knees, and my heart gets sick of nostalgia and feels homesick, and my eyes get full of tears. So homesickness is just matched to the fatigue of blowing so big plots, and the house is usually put at the center, so it's very far from anything from the next house that is also located at the center of the other 160 acres plot, but also because of these people come from different areas. So basically, they, do not they have different schooling, and they have different vernacular languages, and so they do not know each other, have problems in communicating to each other, and also separate from kilometers of distance before finding somebody speaking the same language. Pearl writes to the column of Magazine for Pioneers and says, well, in the beginning, I was missing my friends and all neighbors so much. Imagine to be 60 miles away from a post office. So this is what happened. So it was also hard to get mail. That's why we have somehow so many documents written with the eye, because these people have somehow to write journals and letters and somehow testimonies of their experiences, because these forced isolation make them try to find at least some correspondence, even with the magazine, or sharing their own experiences with other readers. Imagine these women that come from those little villages, maybe Massachusetts, like Harriet, or from Germany or Norway, and all of a sudden they live in a hut, in a horrible hut. So they had read so many beautiful things about the beauty of this land, but then there's nothing to build up a house with. There are no trees, no sort of timber. So maybe they try to build up houses by getting it on the side of a hill. And sometimes the husbands stay away for weeks looking for jobs to make a living while the land starts producing some fruits. And so women remain there alone with the children for weeks, for months sometimes. And the wife of a pioneer writes, sometimes I have the impression to be able to bear anything but silence. Silence is terrible. And when my husband is too far away in the cornfields, and so that I can't hear the tractor moving, I can even listen to silence just lying in me as a heavy cloud. So if I'm doing the washing up, I start making noises with the dishware. So I've never thought about the sort of solitude generated by silence. So this physical solitude becomes also a deeper and more inner solitude, as another one writes. So we have been taken away from the tomb of my little girl, and I used to tear all through the time. No friend to understand my pain. I have no acquaintances here. I don't know anybody. It's such a huge expanse of land, of nature. Even though this region is extremely beautiful, to me it's so solitary, as if I was enclosed in a grave. So, if originally there is this sense of limitless possibilities that is at the heart of the origin of the American people, there is another aspect that is less well known, that is this solitude. So feeling lonely is quite mysterious, because then it unfolds in different forms and shapes and starts at different moments, like in the tale Sophistication by Sherwood Anderson. And so we have the annual Pioneer Fair that has just ended. So at the end of the day, the main character gets to the place of the fair that is deserted. Nobody's there. And he says, so I see that now is night and there is no more life. And the silence is terrifying. I decide to hide. I remain silent behind a trunk. And so I become more and more reflective than I usually am. And again, this solitude expresses itself, so I'm really sort of making a leapfrog of decades after coming back to the moon, so the most extreme going west. So as happens to Buzz Aldrin after the expedition of Apollo 11 in 1969. So after the world tour, Aldrin writes in his second autobiography, I was physically exhausted and emotionally distraught. I felt that my marriage was not working at all. It always was. So a sense of guilt and desperation started to arise in me. There was no meaning in my job. I knew that I would never ever able to go back to the moon. At night, I was tormented by questions, but in the morning I had no answers. What would I have done that day? Which mission would I have had? Well, why waking up if there is no extraordinary mission in sight? And then what? Once your dreams have come true, what are you going to do? What does a man do after having walked on the moon? I had flown to the moon, and the moon doesn't cover my feet. But now what? What was in stock for me? What could I do now with my life? Well, to sum up, it is extremely interesting the fact that in the American language, as far as I know, is the only case in a sort of European related origin languages. So we have the word loneliness, that is the traditional experience of being lonely, but also with the second term, solitude. It is a silence that let the inner voice come up to the surface. So my intuition is that this solitude has something to do with the deep reasons of the issues touched upon by Greg. So the fact that we are not able to live in silence, because this silent dimension becomes a sort of roaring. It's a concern when there is no clear way to take. So hiding in a bubble, in a safe space, is reassuring, so that you can keep the drama life out with its questions. So that seems to be the most obvious solution. But this, and I think that some of the consequences explained by Greg are very interesting, is a very interesting contemporary documentation, is not enough, because the bubble, the safe space, the cocoon cannot sort of keep reality away. The fear that something can make this frail equilibrium sort of break, fill people of anxiety, and then the bubble is too small. And so, as Marianne Moore wrote, the cure for loneliness. So the only solution to this is solitude. Thank you very much.
proporrei di usare un po' il tempo che abbiamo.
We still have some time, which we can use to address three main points, as there's been a dialogue between the two texts presented. First of all, I would like to invite Greg. And you, Greg, has described a picture of America, especially focusing on the reality of American campuses. In a way, it is a worrying picture. It is a polarized picture. You said that there's the good against the bad. There is no sympathy. And it seems it is impossible to build things together. It looks like it's even impossible to think of doing that, of building something. So the first question I would like to share concerns this. I wouldn't go to the reasons behind this, but in your experience, in your work, and you're also a lawyer, and in your job, you have to go against the university, and you bring them to court, you take them to court, you defend the people. And you do this for your love for freedom of people. So my question is, at this level, where did you see that there can be the possibility to build something together based on the fact that there is no previous agreement? In your experience, did you see anything like this?
One of the things that brought me and Jonathan Haidt together is an intense interest in polarization. And one of and this may seem like an odd match for someone who cares about freedom of speech so passionately, but I want freedom of speech to also deliver something important to our democracy, something functional to our society that can make it a better society. And so people prejudging someone from a different region of the country, a different class or background as evil in advance is corrosive, extremely harmful to our democracy. So I'm a First Amendment lawyer who spends a lot of time thinking about how you can actually get people to see each other as people. And I think that there are very interesting projects starting up across the country because we are so polarized right now. Everything's accelerated, partially with the Trump victory. It seems like the left is moving much farther, much more rapidly to the left. The right is moving into crazy town. And one of the projects that I've been really interested in involves taking people from, say, depressed areas of Kentucky, very rural places where coal mining jobs, for example, have gone from 20,000 to zero. And having them talk to people from much more liberal educated parts of the country, like, say, once again, like Amherst, Massachusetts, our college town, a very wealthy college town in Massachusetts. And the way some of the projects are constructed is simply let this person tell you who they are and what they care about with no thought of changing their mind. Just sit in a room and listen. And that's really powerful. I can imagine sort of like in the pioneer experience, when you have that one, you run into that one person in the entire world that you can talk to, you do actually get a lot better at listening than you would have been in the mile-a-minute world of America today. And as soon as you can see the person on the other side as an actual person who is not simply stupid or evil, you have progress. There's an even more advanced version of this project in which they would take kids from Trump country and go to the Bronx to meet with high school kids, usually white kids meeting black kids from the Bronx. And the goal would actually be for them to talk for quite some time. And then at the end of it, one of the kids from the Bronx explains from her own voice the experiences of the girl from the heartland and vice versa. And that extra element of knowing someone so well, I can explain you to these people, that's lessons in empathy. how this relates in part to what Martina was talking about, also comes back to what we call in the book problems of progress. That essentially it turned out there were actually great advantages to having this awful, rigorous experience of people who were homesteaders. It taught us about an internal vastness of the human spirit and mind that really excited Americans for a long time. The fact that solitude, I wasn't really aware that solitude was a uniquely American word because it's so central, to what we think the good life is. We get nervous about people who can't be alone. With that seems to speak badly of your character, even though we understand entirely that we are social animals. But not being able to experience and enjoy solitude, that strikes us as strange. And I do think it in part explains the total interest in the U.S., the surprisingly large interest in the U.S. for things like Buddhism and meditation and all this kind of stuff. But anyway, I hope you do all get to see Martina's event. I know there's a very long wait, but it's worth it. It inspired all sorts of thoughts in me that I could drone on for hours about.
Volevo anche sentire da te.
I would like to know something else. September this year, I asked you to invite me, and you invited me to a conference that you organize with university professors that share a special interest for this freedom of speech. And that's why I asked you about the origin and what was that job for you. I mean, it was not the first time that you did so. And I was so struck by those people having ideas, absolutely and radically different ideas, but that were able, as you said, to share empathy, the ability to listen to the other and somehow to help each other and support each other and express freely their ideas in that place. So in such a polarized world where people, that a liberal person was sort of inclined to help a person that was on the other side of the spectrum, but to help that person express its own thinking and ideas in a campus, because in the world we are living in, that would like sort of helping the enemy. So what's the origin of that initiative? And what did you find out as a surprise?
Well, I find it just absolutely thrilling that Josè was so inspired by our professor conference. This is something I'd wanted to do for years, because when you interact with people, no matter how polarized we are, there is a type of person, and I'm among them, that is very concerned about our own confirmation bias. That we know people, particularly in echo chambers, can be extraordinarily foolish, and that you have to have. There's a certain amount of self-doubt that you have to have, in my opinion, to be an intelligent, curious person. And our universities, sadly, tend to be so, they form echo chambers so much within them. There was a horrifying study talking about the more education you have in the U.S., the less you interact with people who disagree with you politically. And that went straight up from high school, and people with high school educations interact with the most. And by the time you get to PhDs, the interaction with people who politically differ from you it shrinks to a tiny number. But still within higher education, and there are these people who desperately want someone to just disagree with them constructively, point out how they've been foolish, point out how they've been wrong, and take criticism. And I'd wanted to do this conference for years. We got together a bunch of very curious minds in higher education. It continues to be a very small conference, but absolutely delightful to watch this intellectual process where the rules are essentially you have to sort of check your own feelings at the door to a degree. You have to be able to take criticism, and you have to listen to it. All things that academics should already know how to do, but unfortunately within an echo chamber, that's very hard to do. And it's been absolutely delightful seeing this idealized intellectual process kind of running again, where people aren't saying, but at the end of my first book, I really should have included this. I wanted to have a chapter, another fictionalized chapter at the end of my first book, Unlearning Liberty, which was exclusively about free speech on campus, about going to a party of a bunch of PhDs and academics, say in like San Francisco, and finding out that someone completely disagrees with you on a particular hot button political issue. And that person going, oh my God, you have to talk to Fred. Oh my God, you have to talk to all these people. This is going to be great. And pointing out how different that sounds than our actual experience when you go to some of these interactions, both among academics and among people who might be Republican, for example, that there's no excitement and curiosity about where people are coming from. And unfortunately, very little value seen in being wrong and being proven wrong, which I think all curious minds should crave. So the fact that José got so much out of the conference, it makes me extraordinarily happy. I just wish there was more of it.
Martina, tu eri parte della conferenza.
I joined that conference, and so I asked you the same question. So, is there anything giving you hope, even if little hope? So, are there experiences that show you that it's possible to somehow grow with somebody else, even if you do not agree with that person? Well, I started from that FIRE conference organized by Greg, because in October I joined that conference, and he talks about a place where criticism is accepted. Well, this is a sort of euphemism, because actually the thing that shocked me when I got there is the way people had no problems in openly criticizing anything that was said. Imagine a room with, 100 people, and from sort of any kind of walk of life and political opinions. And so let's imagine that a professor delivers a speech, 20, 30 minutes, 40 minutes, well prepared, of course. And then the first person raised their hand and said, well, I totally disagree with everything you just said. And the thing that shocked me the most is that it was the beginning of a conversation and a debate. So it was not the end, not a wall, not at all. It was just the beginning. So then you could discuss for an hour and a half. And the conversation lasting, 1 year and a half, after 30, 40 minutes of presentation, led everybody to sort of go beyond a certain level of, knowledge. So I could tell you a lot about the Middle Ages or other topics like the so-called disputatio, so the sort of debates that existed in medieval times, so the discussion between people from different sort of sides to get to a greater level of knowledge. But instead of going back to the past, I would like to share with you an example that is closest to me, that has to do with the exhibition Bubbles, Pioneers and the Girl from Hong Kong. So the original idea stems from some common work done with these friends, 10 people, a dozen of people that live and work in the US and that have talents and skills that are totally different. We have a film producer from Hollywood, a sort of physics teacher, a professor of philosophy from Washington, a real estate agent from Colorado, an architect designing luxury skyscrapers, two musicians and composers from New York, and a marketing director of a company that designs projections for the largest fun parks and museums in the US. Well, each one of us brought his or her little piece. their talents and skills, but also sensitivity, temper, and completely different approaches. So, I mean, we were continuously exchanging and debating, and we came from different countries. We had different jobs, and were sort of used to different approaches. So all that led to criticism, discussions. Oh, we should have straight lines. No, curved lines. Oh, this means this. No, it means that. So I would prefer some happy music, no, some sad music. But the most incredible thing was, the blooming of things that went far beyond the simple sum of the single pieces. So that was great. So that was just a sort of an epiphany. And it was so interesting and fascinating from this point of view. Just a tip of the iceberg for me. I know that time is ticking, and I would like to talk about solitude once again. Greg, you just mentioned solitude at one point. Yeah. Hello. Yeah. We are Americans. You have to get used to this. So, solitude. You mentioned solitude. And you see it as a very important part, and that seems to be somehow hidden in the U.S. I mean, this is something that is not so well known. So Martina had this intuition, and she said, so the inability to be able to bear this silence may lead to a certain kind of fear. And she mentioned these sort of sentence that leads us to the difference between solitude and loneliness. But also we're social animals. You said it too. So we need company. And so I think that Martina's words do not express contradiction about that. So appreciating silence does not go against liking company. But what is your personal experience in this respect? So, I mean, to what extent solitude and silence sort of are part of your life? And it's not just about having friends. Having friends is great. It's beautiful.
So it's always so interesting to see your own country from someone else's eyes, and you learn so much about it. For me, it was really sort of just an implicit value. I spent a lot of my childhood by myself in my basement, playing with a string, coming up with comic book stories, and never wanted anybody to interact with when I was doing that. People, I think I probably would have diagnosed with something in the current state of the United States. And what's interesting is that to be reminded through this experience of you can see this as a theme throughout American history, of this idea that kind of like you can't sit in a room, you can't go to a cabin in the woods and be happy. Doesn't make any sense. That's not. That somehow it felt almost immoral to not have that. And I think that in my first, in a book called Freedom from Speech, a very short book that I wrote, Freedom from Speech, not Freedom of Speech, when I said that something is about society, American society are changing, I called them problems of comfort as opposed to problems of progress. And what I meant by that is as certain technological things get better, as we move on as a society, there's things that are otherwise very good are going to produce some very negative results as well. It doesn't mean that I think that we should all live in 1890, but I do think getting back to the idea or being aware of the idea of the importance of being able to be alone, of testing yourself in that way, of sitting with your own mind in a quiet room is something that we forget was actually part of the American experience, that artist after artist. I think of F. Scott Fitzgerald, having this epiphany standing on top of the Empire State Building for the first time, and it hitting him with a little sense of horror because he thought New York could be infinite. But I think those kind of realizations, that sense of smallness, that sense of aloneness, I think that's something very powerful. And I think as America ages, we lose some of that sort of thing that was only possible in an atmosphere where you were kind of forced to be alone time and time again. But when I think of moments, when I think of happy moments in my life, most of them, not most of them, but so many of them are simply walking from point A to point B through my hometown or through New York City or in bad parts of Washington, D.C. It's the walking, And I think that I really have to hand it to Martina and José for pointing out this part of American culture that I'm afraid we're losing, and it's leading to something much nastier and much smaller and much sadder. Thank you.
E la parte sociale?
What about the social part? Because you said, well, it's nice to be alone from time to time, but what about friendship?
Americans can absolutely. The idealized cowboy and the idealized hero in the American story is oversimple by a lot. And you have writers like Ayn Rand. My father's Russian, and she's another Russian immigrant who took the lessons of America, but took them to this really great extreme where it's just about individuals. Only individuals move the world, and they need no help, and they're great people. That's silly. You need friends, you need help in every endeavor that you do, and so the complete extreme version of the John Wayne style loner is itself a little silly. But I do think that there's a middle ground in which you respect, I actually see some of it in my mother's culture, which is British, where you respect people's autonomy. They need to be left alone. You want to respect their independence on various things. You want to respect their space. And there's something that is both respecting solitude and loving the person, but not trying to teach the person that they can't handle their own life, to send the signal that you are so weak that you need me to come out and help. And I've seen this from some of my British relatives, and I gotta say, it seems cold sometimes to outsiders, but it can be very, very empowering to have a friend put his arm under your shoulder and look at you with great confidence and say, you can handle this.
A te, Martina, la tua tesi.
Martina, get back to you. What's your take on this link between solitude and the current times? So can you tell us more about, this silence and solitude you told us about? It was very nice, your reflection. Well, first of all, while Greg was talking, I thought about Tocqueville, who already said to what extent Americans are inclined to solitude. So there is this trait of, liking solitude. Probably this is something that is typical of mankind for a number of reasons, because openness, mobility, the level of uncertainty of these people that come to these huge places, and the fact that there is no sort of pre-existing conditioning and preconditioning, all that develops a sort of inclination to solitude that is typically American. By the way, there is another European that realizes this uniqueness of the American language, is Paul Tillich, a theologist, and he explains these two words in the following way. He says, our language as being able to perfectly perceive the two dimensions of the man of being lonely. Loneliness was created to express the pain of being alone, and solitude to express the splendor of being alone, the beauty of being alone. So what is this solitude then? Well, I think we can go back to the words of Wendell Berry, another American author, who wrote on this topic. So we enter solitude. Let's get into the solitude that let us leave behind the loneliness. The real solitude can be found in pristine places, and your own inner voice then can be heard. That's why you want to reach solitude. So you are just then attracted to your most inner sources, and then you can better respond to other people's lives. These thought-provoking ideas somehow seems then to look for other people to build together, like pioneers in the West. So after what I told you, things go on, and then there's bustling of life, plenty of activities. So people that are so far away start getting together to build something together. They try to build schools and churches and meeting places, ballrooms. So dance was a universal language still today. So if you come to Nebraska, well, at least this is the very first thing that shocked me and struck me 7 years ago when I first got there, was this human side, this human dimension, this life full of relations, as if all that fatigue and difficulty of isolation experienced by the pioneers pushed them to get together more than others. So that's why, and that's how people get together. Then we have authors like Barry who talked about the plenitude of silence. So when I was preparing the exhibition together with my friends, there was something else that stuck to my mind. Lee Jeffries, a photographer from London, expressed something similar. Lee Jeffries, did you see the exhibition? Well, if you saw it, there are beautiful close-ups. He made them. And he explains this work like that. Love was the origin of everything. It brought to me so much joy, but also brought me a lot of loneliness that continues today. But this is the driving force of any artistic endeavor. Well, many close-ups are homeless people close-ups. I took pictures of them not because they are homeless, but because they perfectly express the solitude that is with me every day when I walk alone. This is still and has ever been my starting point. That's why he decides to share periods of his life with these people and then take pictures of them. So, José, you told me about the link between these elements. Well, first of all, you talked about friendship. Having friends is not just beautiful, it's key. And not simply from a human point of view, but also from a social and economic point of view. Again, I go back to the pioneers, and there was a study made by the University of Nebraska, and it was published a couple of years ago, made by a group of professors. So they started homesteads one by one. So they traced back the history of each homestead, trying to see what happened next. So how many of these people, after 5 years, were actually able, after so much sacrifice and problems, to become owners of that plot of land, and then which nationality they got, and did they tend to look for people from the same nationality, or did they prefer to stay alone? So this study was so accurate, presenting loads of statistical and mathematical data, and the results were outstanding because they found out that the vast majority of these pioneers that had got there succeeds in becoming the owners of those plots of land. And that leads to another fact, because then the Midwest becomes the biggest farming area of the U.S., especially for some crops like corn, because we have the biggest world producers here. So how is that possible? How was that possible? So much sacrifice, so many problems. And in spite of that, the vast majority succeeds in becoming owners. And well, the answer to this question is the following. So homesteading was not a solitary activity. So those people from the very beginning form communities that were favored by some geographical proximity, and those proved to be key for their success. So they become, the pounding heart. And then there's also the justice issue, because there were no sheriffs when they got there. There was no police. But in spite of that, frauds, were very, very reduced and limited, 5%, in terms of land boundaries and so on. How was that possible, considering that there was no surveillance, no law enforcement, and these professors found out that communities freely organized themselves to keep an eye on what was happening. If there were squatters, so people that squatted illegally empty houses, well, then the village got together to kick them out. So that was totally spontaneous from the grassroots, and because of that, the level of fraud was kept very, very low. And that was crucial, but was not enough. I go back to the letter I read you beforehand. So the pioneer mother that has her little girl die during the journey towards the west, and she says and writes, and nobody else can understand my pain. And she ends her letter sent home saying, my heart is sad, so sad. And I'm happy about the fact that one day I will die, as if even this beautiful company, leaves this open space at the very end. No, we're not finished yet. I have a last question for Greg. Well, I carefully listened to both of you, and so I heard that community helps you being better alone, friendship. And also, Greg, in your speech, you said that one of the leading causes of young people's problems are their parents. And you talked a lot about the loss, of children playing alone in an unorganized way, the fact that you have helicopter parents that are not good at all, too much involved in their children's lives. And you love freedom so much. It's a very important principle for you, and that you follow. And you have children also. I can't believe that you watch them go away with no concern. So you brought them with you here and you let them hang out, and you're perfectly all right with that. So to end this conversation, I have a question for you. What does that mean to love freedom, to love your children? And you talk a lot about these topics, but it's not easy to make all these things go hand in hand.
It's kind of funny because, I'm this advocate of what's called free-range parenting in the U.S. It's kind of a joke on free-range chickens, that essentially chickens that are allowed to walk around farms. And that we've gotten away from a style of parenting where kids actually have a great deal of freedom. And it's partially because it's a little bit of a revolt, unplanned revolt against the cliche, what's considered sometimes the cliche of the rugged individualism of America. Those kind of arguments started to sound kind of stale and sort of cliche and all this kind of stuff. So parents saw sort of increasing benefits to micromanaging their children, because some of these higher education institutions that are very elite have ridiculous ideas of what childhood should be like, and they'll favor kids, and I'm not exaggerating, who have 11 extracurriculars, outside activities, plus a 4.0, plus, and what this leads to is a style of parenting that we call paranoid parenting in the book, where kids are scheduled from 6 a.m. to 11. And this is why I didn't like the title Coddling. I have great sympathy for these kids, because I talked to the dean of admission at Stanford, my legal alma mater, And she talked about these genius kids showing up. They're built like perfectly designed heat-seeking missiles. They've been taught only academic topics from day to night. They are the best at advanced mathematics when they show up at college, but they don't know how to use a dishwasher. They call their parents to help them make any decision. And you see these brilliant, disempowered kids, and you think about that pioneer model, which, as I said, can be taken greatly to excess and has time and time again in the United States. But you also think about that person, how empowered they felt, by the end of that, to be kind of like, I can handle going to the woods with minimal help and making a life there. You're afraid of the dishwasher because nobody told you how to use the dishwasher. And so I think one of the reasons why the book, I think, has been so successful, because it actually ended up 8 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list, we were really shocked at how popular the book was. Because I think a lot of parents are like, I think we're missing something. I think we're doing something wrong. And it is realizing that our grandparents and our great-grandparents had this wisdom about, they have to learn how to interact with each other. They have to have empty time. They have to learn how to be bored. I think of all the great thoughts I've ever had, all these the good ones that I find satisfying internally. They're usually at times when I should have been bored or was previously bored, and it comes to you. So, and I do think in part this is also produced by income inequality and produced with stratification in the U.S. that it's encouraging this kind of parenting that is absolutely toxic to people understanding how to live as a free person, how to live as an empowered person, and how to live as a person who's not terrified of even the small abrasions of everyday life.
I tuoi figli?
Your children, what about them? Are you afraid of leaving them alone or to leave them?
It's something that I have to say a lot when I speak about this is I am an anxious parent. I want to hug my two little boys. I have a 3.5-year-old and a 1.5-year-old, little redheads named Benjamin and Maxwell. And I want to crush them so hard, hugging them and never let them out of my sight. And actually, my wife does a good job of reminding me of my principles on this. They have to run. They have to get the scraped knees. They have to play with sticks. They have to do all these things. And I want to be clear. It's not as if Height and I are like, oh, this is easy, whatever. No. There's a part of you that is, and there was a part of the pioneer parents who wanted to take every child they could and hug them tight to their chest and make sure that nothing ever hurts them. But they knew that was harmful. And it became kind of cliche, it became kind of dismissed for people to actually come out and say, surely parents, we know this is harmful to our own children as well. And I think that in addition to mine and John's book, there are projects like Let Grow in the United States, which we advocate for a lot in the book, which is all about letting children experience childhood again. So I'm not claiming that it's easy. I think that, by the way, other cultures have built-in norms that help protect them from this. I'm very curious about how this looks in other cultures. And I have found that in some cultures, including German, there's a very high, and interestingly in Japanese culture, a very high value put on independence of children, of letting them to have autonomy. And I love the fact that when you interview parents there and you ask them, they will say flat out, we don't find this easy. We just think it's important. We don't want these children to be afraid of their own shadow. We want them to be, we're not raising them to be children, we're raising them to be adults. So and I always have to emphasize, we don't think it's easy, but the empowered kid, the kid who no longer needs you anymore, the one that breaks your heart a little bit thinking about it, is the one you really want.
Grazie Greg, grazie Martina.
Thank you very much, Greg. Thank you very much, Martina. I would simply like to remind you that the meeting is a unique event that allows conversations like this one. It is free, totally free, our and your responsibility to support it, because we would like this kind of event to exist also in the future. So in the fairground area, you will find a specific sort of stations with the red heart, with the donate now logo. Please be generous and donate for the meeting. Thank you very much, and have a nice meeting. Thank you.